It was a Tuesday night, already dark, and I was sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot I hadn't planned to stop at. The engine was still running. The radio was low. I wasn't hungry. I'd eaten dinner an hour earlier. I remember noticing that, actually, that I wasn't even solving a problem. I was just tired in that specific way where the idea of driving straight home felt heavier than pulling into a lot and walking under bright lights for no real reason. I told myself I might grab something small, maybe a drink, maybe nothing. That's usually how it starts. Not with a decision, just a pause. And in that pause, money tends to slip out quietly. I used to think spending showed up as excitement or impulse. Lately, I've noticed it shows up as fatigue. The kind where $5 feels lighter than thinking. Where swiping a card feels easier than asking why I'm even here. That moment felt harmless. It almost always does. I've been realizing how much of my spending lives in that category we call convenience. Delivery fees, app markups, the extra couple dollars to avoid one small inconvenience. None of it feels reckless. It actually feels responsible, like I'm protecting my time or my energy. I used to defend it pretty hard. I'd say things like, it's not like I'm buying dumb stuff, I'm just making life easier. And that felt true. The weird part is how neutral those charges feel when they happen. They don't spike your heart rate. They don't come with guilt. They just slide through. A few dollars here, a few more there. I didn't really track them because I didn't think there was anything to track. This is the part I didn't want to look at first. Because once you start adding convenience up, it stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling like something you've been quietly paying for every month without ever agreeing to the total. Food spending was the easiest place for me to lie to myself. Not restaurants, not sit-down meals. I mean the stuff that lives in between. The coffee I grabbed because I was already out. The breakfast sandwich because I skipped eating at home. The lunch that wasn't fast food but also wasn't groceries. I told myself it didn't count. It was cheaper than a restaurant, so it felt responsible by comparison. I remember genuinely believing I barely spent money on food. Then one afternoon, I scrolled back through a month of charges and felt this slow, quiet resistance rise up in my chest. Not panic, just a kind of annoyance, like I was being unfairly accused. That reaction surprised me because the numbers weren't wrong. They were just there. A few dollars at a time, nothing dramatic. But together they painted a picture I hadn't agreed to. Or maybe I had. Just without saying it out loud, subscriptions are sneaky because they don't feel like spending. They feel like decisions you already made. Streaming services, storage upgrades, random apps that started as free trials. I don't remember choosing to keep most of them. They just stayed, month after month, $12 here, $9.99 there. I used to tell myself I'd cancel when I stopped using them, but the truth is I stopped using them way before I stopped paying. There's something weirdly uncomfortable about canceling. It forces you to admit that past you thought this would matter, and present you knows it doesn't. I noticed how long I let some of these charges run simply because they were small enough not to trigger action. They lived below my attention line. Not expensive enough to worry about, not useful enough to justify, just quietly collecting rent in my bank account. I'll fix it later might be the most expensive sentence I've ever said to myself. Later always feels safer than now. Later feels calmer, smarter, like future me will have more time, more clarity, more energy. I use that logic for everything. I'd notice something small and think, yeah, that's not ideal, but it's not urgent. And that's how it survived. Months passed like that. Years sometimes. Nothing blew up, which felt like proof that everything was fine. What I didn't notice was how patient I was with costs and how impatient I was with awareness. Looking felt uncomfortable. Fixing could wait. So later became this place where responsibility lived, and now became the place where money quietly kept leaving without a conversation. Credit cards were never a problem for me in the dramatic sense. No emergencies, no giant balances, just leftovers. A couple $100 here, a few hundred there. I'd tell myself it wasn't real debt because I could pay it off any time. And technically that was true, but I didn't. I let balances roll because the minimum felt harmless. The interest didn't show up as a feeling, it showed up as a number I avoided looking at too closely. I remember skipping past that line on statements like it was an opinion I didn't ask for. What surprised me later was how normal it started to feel. Carrying a balance became background noise. And once something becomes normal, it stops asking for attention. It just keeps charging rent for being ignored. Gas is one of those expenses that feels fixed, even though it isn't. I noticed how rarely I questioned it. I took the same routes, filled up at the same stations, didn't really check prices. It was just part of the week, part of the routine, and routines feel neutral. That's the dangerous part, because every time I chose the easier route, the closer station, the quicker stop, I was making a decision without feeling like I was deciding anything. I wasn't choosing expensive gas. I was choosing not to think. And over time, not thinking has a cost. It's small enough to ignore, but steady enough to matter. That realization didn't hit all at once. It crept in slowly, like noticing a noise that's been there the whole time. I have a habit of upgrading things just in case. Extra storage, faster shipping, higher tiers I might need someday. I framed it as being prepared, being smart. What I didn't admit was how comforting those upgrades felt. Like they protected me from future inconvenience. Most of the time, that future never showed up. I paid for capacity I didn't use, speed I didn't need, insurance against scenarios that stayed imaginary. When I finally noticed, it wasn't because one upgrade was expensive. It was because there were so many of them. Little safety nets stacked on top of each other. Each one felt reasonable. Together, they felt heavy, and I couldn't remember agreeing to the total. Emotional spending doesn't announce itself as emotional. That's something I learned the slow way. I wasn't sad buying or angry buying in any obvious sense. It was subtler than that. A long day, a frustrating email, a general sense of being worn down. I'd buy something small and call it a reward, not a splurge, just a little relief. The feeling would pass quickly, the charge wouldn't. I remember looking at statements later and struggling to remember why I bought certain things. Not because they were useless, but because the emotion they were tied to was already gone. The purchase stayed, the feeling didn't. That imbalance sat with me longer than I expected. One afternoon, I did the math on a habit I'd never questioned. About $8 a day, that was it. Didn't sound real when I said it out loud. $8 times 5 days was 40, times 50 weeks was $2,000, and that's when I stopped, because $2,000 felt different in my body than 8. I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't broken any rules, but I also hadn't agreed to that number. It just showed up. Quietly. That was the moment that stuck with me. Not because it scared me, but because it made everything else suddenly feel louder. There was a stretch where I stopped opening certain apps. Not because I was afraid of overdrafting or anything like that. I just didn't want the feeling. That slight tightening in my chest, the awareness, avoidance felt calmer. And for a while it worked. I felt fine, normal. But money doesn't care whether you're looking at it. It keeps moving either way. When I finally did open everything again, nothing was shocking. That was almost worse. The numbers weren't dramatic, they were just consistent. And consistency is harder to argue with. Lifestyle creep never looked like a leap for me. It looked like a nudge. Slightly nicer groceries. Slightly better options. Slightly fewer no's. Everything upgraded evenly, so nothing stood out. I couldn't point to one moment where things changed. They just did. What used to feel like a treat became baseline. And baseline is expensive because you stop noticing it. Going backwards starts to feel like loss, even when it's just returning to where you were. That realization didn't come with regret. It came with this quiet understanding of how easy it is to drift without feeling like you're moving at all. Social spending was the hardest to look at honestly. Not because of the money, but because of the why. Saying yes felt easier than explaining no. Splitting checks evenly felt simpler than doing the math. I paid for comfort, for smoothness, for avoiding that half second of awkwardness. At the time, it felt harmless, generous even. Later, I noticed how often those moments added up in the background. I wasn't being irresponsible, I was being agreeable. An agreeable has a price tag that doesn't show up until much later. Digital spending barely registers as spending at all. A few dollars inside an app, a small add-on, a convenience feature. There's no physical exchange. No receipt to crumple up. It feels lighter, less real. That's why it works. I remember scrolling through transactions and feeling disconnected from some of them, like they belonged to a different version of me. The money was real. The memory wasn't. That gap stayed with me because it showed me how easy it is for money to leave when it doesn't feel like anything is leaving with it. Comparison was my favorite shield. At least I'm not doing that. At least I'm not as bad as that. It worked surprisingly well. Every time I noticed something questionable, I could find a worse example and feel better instantly. What I didn't notice was how irrelevant those comparisons were. My bank account didn't care about other people's spending. It only reflected mine. That logic felt obvious in hindsight. At the time, it felt comforting, and comfort can be expensive when it replaces honesty. Some charges were so old, I forgot why they existed. They belonged to a version of me with different priorities, different habits, different assumptions, and I kept paying them. Not because I chose to, but because stopping would require remembering. Auditing the past felt harder than funding it. When I finally noticed how long some of these had been around, it wasn't shocking. It was quiet. Like realizing you've been carrying something heavy for so long you stopped feeling its weight. I relied on future income more than I realized. I assumed raises, bonuses, better months would smooth things out. And sometimes they did. But future money has a way of arriving already assigned. I'd spend today like tomorrow was wide open. Then tomorrow would show up with its own plans. I wasn't reckless. I was optimistic. And optimism feels harmless until it turns into pressure. That shift happened slowly enough that I didn't notice when it crossed the line. The most reassuring thought I had for years was that I hadn't made any big mistakes. No disasters, no blow-ups. That felt like proof I was doing okay. What I missed was that damage doesn't require drama. It can happen quietly, through habits that feel normal and choices that never trigger alarms. Nothing was wrong. And somehow, things still drifted. That realization didn't come with panic. It came with this low, unsettled feeling I couldn't quite shake. When I started paying attention, I expected clarity. What I got was weight. Awareness didn't fix anything. It just changed the relationship. I saw myself in the patterns, not as careless, just tired, mentally worn down, making small decisions that felt reasonable in the moment. That was uncomfortable, but also relieving in a strange way. It meant I wasn't broken, I was human. And humans tend to leak money when they're exhausted. I still think about that grocery store parking lot sometimes. The engine running, the lights buzzing, the receipt sitting on the seat afterward like it had always been there. Nothing went wrong that night. Nothing dramatic happened. Money just left, quietly, like it had plenty of practice. And I wonder how many times that moment already happened before I noticed it. Probably more than I'd like to admit. Probably enough to matter